So welcome back. Before we move on with this week's lecture, I want to do something a little bit different. I really want to try to situate this week's lecture a bit within the context of some of the material that we've covered thus far. So over the past couple of weeks, we've approached political ecology and urban geography as subdisciplines within geography, and we've kind of approached them in a bit of a historical lens so as to understand the development of each field and some of the key theories associated with each field. What we have not done thus far is try to merge the two fields together. So this week, that's what we're going to start doing. We're going to try to merge these two fields together, and in other words, we're basically going to explore questions of political ecology within the urban context. And we'll really get to begin to work towards how to approach questions of urban political ecology. Now, that being said, the theme for this week is slums. We're going to talk about the phenomenon of slums. And slums, as I speak of them, are really a manifestation of inequitable political and economic structures. They're also a phenomenon that really typifies the environmental degradation that can result from such inequitable structures. So now, before we move forward, quick few refreshers on political ecology first, and then urban geography. So first, with regards to political ecology, I want to go into some of the foundational critiques. So if we go back to one of the key texts we focused on, we focused a lot on the Blakey and Brookfield piece, and that was a land degradation piece from '87. The piece has been subject to a lot of critique, and much of this critique revolves around three main points. And so those points are, first, that this is a poverty-centric approach. It privileges poverty as a central driver to political ecology issues. It doesn't see poverty as an extraneous or external influence. It's really the core. Now, second, the approach privileges the rural, the agrarian, and third world matters. So what we don't get to see are urban issues. We don't get to examine first world issues. Finally, the approach really privileges land over other resources. So that being said, we don't get into issues of water or clean air or forests, whatever other resources there are many of them, minerals, what have you. We just don't get to explore those. So those are some key critiques from political ecology that we're going to try to address. And now some key critiques of urban geography. We've explored classical approaches to understanding the development of the city. We've read that in the Chicago School, for example. We've also discussed some of the early urban sociological literature, and this literature really engages with issues of gender or race or income, poverty. Now, all of this is great, but the problem is we don't get at the environment. None of this literature really questions issues of the environment, and if they do, it's really only tangentially. So those are some of the urban critiques that we kind of want to resolve a little bit. So if we take these two critiques together, the critiques of political ecology and the critiques of urban geography, and we merge them, we see that urban political ecology can really be understood as situated at the nexus of these two fields, as a sort of response to the shortfalls of both early urban sociological literature, early urban geography, and early political ecology. Okay, so let's get on to the new stuff. For this week, you had to read the Peets and Watts piece. And in the introduction, they asked some really interesting questions. And these are the sorts of questions that we really need to start engaging with. So just to remind you of those questions, they asked, how, for example, might poverty or political ecology help explain worker injuries in plants in northern Mexico, or toxic dumping in Nigeria, or urban water pollution in turn? So it's questions like this which we're going to turn to this week. And I want you all to try to focus less on the details and, for example, the statistics that I may present, and more on the way in which questions are asked and the ideas that are kind of merged together, how issues of politics and economics and environment are brought together very cohesively when you're taking a political ecology lens. So moving on to the slum. As a political ecologist, rather than asking questions about urban growth and urban development in the formal sense, we may want to take note of things like the massive increase in the size of cities and the presence of slums in the second half of the 20th century. We might want to take these two things, the growth of cities and the growth of slums, and ask questions like, what is the relationship between the explosion of urban growth in the 1970s and the fact that that growth is informal growth? Why do these two things go together, and what accounts for them? Now, I do want to note that answering questions like this can be particularly tricky because by nature, you are dealing with informal subject matter. So that being said, departments of planning, state agencies, etc., in their published works, oftentimes they just do not account for the largest portions of urban growth, which is the informal growth. And this really makes it hard to understand the origins and the implications of all of this. We also get to see then how not only do slums result from inequitable power and formal institutions, but we can also see how slums are able to perpetuate when those formal institutions do not acknowledge the slums. That's a huge issue. So let's first remind ourselves why we're looking at the urban. Why is it that the city is so important? Over-urbanization, we've discussed this before. It's happening on a global scale, and it's driven significantly by the reproduction of poverty. Now, this is interesting because it's not driven necessarily by the supply of jobs. So I don't move to the city because I say, oh, hey, look, I can go get a job there. There are tons of jobs available. I move to the city because I'm forced to, because my income isn't sufficient, and I'm being basically forced into the city. I'm forced into really unstable areas of the city. We also have a number of cities in the world that are exceeding 20 million in population, and that's huge. That's a massive number. We have even more cities that are approaching or exceeding 10 to 12 million people in population. And there's no sign of the process abating until at least 2050, if that, and that's a guess. So in other words, urbanization is now becoming the norm. But it's not urbanization proper that's becoming the norm. It's slum growth. Slum growth is outpacing urbanization proper. So for example, in Mexico City, 60% of all growth is informal. That's massive. That's the majority of growth. On the other hand, if you look at the developed world, the ratio of slum to city is 6%, about there. And when I talk about slum in the developed world, I'm really talking about tenements, about public housing, basically about housing that already is recognized legally. On the other hand, if you look at a developing country like Ethiopia, 94% of city dwellers in Ethiopia live in informal houses or practice informal business. That's actually the exact inverse of Boston, to give you some perspective. So simply put, informal urbanism represents the majority of urbanism now. So what makes slums unique? Why do we want to look at them? Well, as a political ecologist, we see that the reality of a slum is very different than a city like Manchester. The classic forms of city-country don't explain the slum. We need now to resort to new terms, for example, like peri-urban. We have areas that are extremely dense in population, yet they are not coupled with the sort of infrastructure that we're accustomed to in an urban area. So, for example, you may have the population density of a city, but the area may be built with informal materials that we're not accustomed to building within the city. It might not have water infrastructure, it might not have waste management, etc. Another issue is that though slums may be immediately adjacent to formal cities or even within formal cities, there's a disassociation between slum dwellers and formal city dwellers. So, in other words, the slum dwellers may be entirely disconnected from the economic and social infrastructure of the formal city that they're right next to or even within. Interestingly enough, we're also seeing a change in the countryside-city relation. In many places, cities are becoming de-industrialized, whereas the countryside is becoming increasingly industrialized and more of a productive center than it has been in the past. So a political ecology lens allows us to see how this shift in production location not only affects, for example, population migration, and the location of jobs, but it really affects the way in which societies and populations in a particular area engage with their environment. And I just want to highlight that point because that's a central point in political ecology. We really want to understand why certain populations engage with their environment in the way that they do. What historical factors have led them to that sort of engagement? So what makes a slum and what makes it an issue of urban political ecology? Now, the locations of slums are largely based on a pretty hard calculus of kind of confusing trade-offs. Basically, what you want to do is optimize housing costs, tenure security, quality of shelter, journey to work, and personal safety. So, for example, if you're on a fixed salary, housing can't use up all of your income. You need extra money to buy food, for example. So that's an issue. Tenure security. Does the person who rents to you, does that person own the property? If not, is the owner in discussions with the renter? Do you have a guarantee that they will continue to rent to you? Do you have a guarantee that the price of your rental unit will remain the same? Quality of shelter. This is a huge issue. Does your home or apartment come with a bathroom or a roof, for example? One of the main quality of shelter issues is related to environmental factors. So, for example, in Mexico City, a lot of the slums are built on the edge of Mexico City. Mexico City is shaped like a bowl, so the main development is in the base of the bowl, and the informal development is up on the very precarious, steep edges of the bowl, making it prone to mudslides. So overall, slum development tends to take place in floodplains, toxic environments, dumps, hazardous districts, more or less in places that the city has abandoned, so kind of like the environmental discard, the discarded area. So in sum, there are many pressures that drive individuals to choose informal shelter over formal shelter, and these are political, they're economic, they're social, they're environmental, and this is why it really lies at the center of urban political ecology. The final thing I want to discuss is how did this happen? So before you ask how it happened, you have to ask how it didn't happen before, like 50 years ago. So this goes back to colonial history, and if you look at the way the British controlled India, what you discover is that they regulated growth and didn't permit rural populations to migrate to cities. They controlled population migration, and this was really necessary for the generation of wealth, as we saw when we read the piece on Leopoldville. After emancipation, these new states tried to restrict access to cities because they still recognized the wealth in the country, and they wanted to diversify economies and maintain borders, etc. So slum development began arguably as a result of decolonization. And in the 1970s, what we see is that the minimal role of national governments in urban policy was reinforced by neoliberal economic models that were defined by the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. And these structural adjustment funds imposed on poor nations a series of rules that resulted in a shrinkage in government programs and the privatization of housing markets. And this can really be argued as the impetus to slums. Now, in sum, we have to wrap up. So I want to ask if there are any questions. No? Okay, great.